An entire continent collapsed, cities burned, fields turned to ash, and millions of lives vanished into silence. Almost as if Europe itself was tearing apart from the inside, slowly at first, then all at once. Villages disappeared overnight. Hunger spread like a shadow no one could escape, and fear became the only thing people could trust, because death was never far behind. This was not just another war fought by kings and soldiers. No, this was something far worse, something that consumed everything in its path and left nothing untouched. And yet, out of this chaos, out of unimaginable destruction, a new world began to take shape, one where the old rules no longer applied, where power shifted, borders changed, and the very idea of nations was rewritten forever. But how did one conflict, one spark, spiral so far out of control, and why did its ending change everything we know about the world today? Long before the destruction began, Europe already stood on the edge of collapse, held together by a fragile system that looked powerful on the surface, but beneath it was full of cracks waiting to split open. At the center of it all was the Holy Roman Empire, a vast collection of territories, princes, and cities, all loosely connected under one emperor, yet each with its own ambitions, its own loyalties, and its own hidden tensions. It wasn't a unified empire. It was more like a ticking machine with too many moving parts ready to break at any moment. And then there was religion, the invisible line dividing the continent, where Catholics and Protestants no longer just disagreed, they distrusted, feared, and in many cases hated each other. Rulers were choosing sides, populations were splitting apart, and every decision carried the weight of possible violence. Alliances formed not out of friendship, but out of necessity, and behind every agreement was suspicion. Behind every peace was the threat of war. It felt like Europe was holding its breath, waiting, knowing something was coming, something inevitable. Because when power is divided, when belief turns into conflict, and when no one is willing to step back, history doesn't stay quiet for long, it explodes. The tension finally snapped in the city of Prague, inside a room thick with anger, where voices were no longer calm, no longer controlled, but sharp, loud, and filled with accusation. Protestant nobles stood face to face with imperial officials, their patience gone, their fear turning into fury, because to them, this was no longer politics. It was survival. The air felt heavy, like something terrible was about to happen. And then, in a sudden surge of chaos, everything broke, hands grabbed, shouts erupted. And before anyone could stop it, the officials were dragged toward the window, struggling, shouting, powerless against the rage surrounding them, and then, in a single violent act, they were thrown out, falling from the castle heights into the unknown below. It was shocking, reckless, almost unbelievable. But it wasn't just an act of anger. It was a message, loud and impossible to ignore. This was rebellion. This was defiance. This was the moment when tension turned into open conflict. Word spread quickly, fear followed, and alliances began to shift as rulers across Europe realized what had just happened. This was no longer contained, no longer avoidable. The balance had been shattered. And in that instant, everything changed because that single moment ignited a war that would last 30 years. What began as a rebellion in Prague didn't stay contained for long, because the moment authority was challenged, the reaction came fast, and it came hard. The emperor of the Holy Roman Empire moved to crush the uprising, sending forces to restore control, and for a brief moment, it looked like the conflict might end before it truly began. But then, something shifted. Protestant leaders refused to back down. Alliances were formed in haste, and suddenly, what was once a local crisis became something much bigger. Then Spain stepped in, backing the emperor, determined to protect its influence and crush Protestant resistance, which then alarmed neighboring powers, who saw not just a war, but a growing imbalance of power. And that's when Sweden entered the conflict, bringing fresh armies, new strategies, and a determination to defend Protestant interests. But even that didn't stop the escalation. Because as the war dragged on, shifting alliances and rising fears pulled in an even greater force. France, a Catholic nation, made the unexpected decision to join against the emperor's side, not for religion, but for power, for survival, for control of Europe's future. And just like that, the lines blurred, loyalties twisted, and the war became something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Then one battle led to another. One victory demanded a response. One alliance forced the creation of another. And with every move, the conflict spread wider, deeper, more destructive. There was no pause, no moment to breathe, only constant escalation, like a fire feeding on everything around it. What started as a single spark had now become a continent-wide inferno, pulling kings, armies, and entire nations into its path. And the worst part was, no one could stop it anymore. And then, slowly, almost quietly at first, the war changed. It stopped being a clash between armies, stopped being something fought on distant battlefields, and became something far more terrifying, something that reached into the lives of ordinary people and refused to let go. This wasn't just a war between soldiers anymore. It became a war against entire populations as armies moved across the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. They didn't just fight, they consumed everything in their path, taking food, burning homes, leaving nothing behind for those who lived there. Villages that once echoed with life fell silent, their streets empty, their houses abandoned or destroyed as families fled with nothing, hoping only to survive another day. And for those who couldn't escape, hunger became a constant companion, creeping in slowly, weakening bodies, breaking spirits until survival itself felt like an impossible task. Crops failed, trade collapsed, and entire regions began to crumble under the weight of endless conflict. Disease followed closely behind, spreading through weakened populations, turning suffering into catastrophe, until death became so common it no longer shocked anyone. People weren't just caught in the middle of war. They became its victims, its fuel, its forgotten casualties, and the longer it went on, the worse it became, because there was no relief, no safe place, no end in sight. Everything that once held society together, order, stability, trust, began to fall apart. Piece by piece, what was left was a continent exhausted, broken, and barely holding on, where survival was no longer about living well, but simply about not dying. And in that darkness, it became clear. This war was no longer about victory. It was about endurance, about who could last the longest in a world that seemed determined to destroy itself. And somewhere in the middle of all this destruction, something unexpected happened. The very reason the war had started began to fade. Slowly, almost unnoticed at first, until it was impossible to ignore. What began as a fierce religious struggle between Catholics and Protestants no longer followed those lines, no longer made sense in the way it once did, because as the fighting dragged on, survival, ambition, and power took control, replacing belief as the driving force. Alliances shifted, loyalties blurred, and decisions were no longer about faith, but about dominance, about who would shape the future of Europe when the chaos finally ended. And nothing captures this shift more clearly than the actions of France, a deeply Catholic nation, stepping into the war not to defend its religion, but to weaken its rivals, choosing strategy over belief, power over principle. It was a moment that revealed the truth behind the conflict, that beneath all the banners and declarations, this had become a struggle for control, and once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The war no longer had a clear identity, no simple explanation. It had evolved into something far more complex, far more dangerous. Because when a war loses its original purpose, when it is no longer guided by belief or boundaries, it becomes unpredictable, harder to end, harder to understand. And that is exactly what happened here. A conflict that started with conviction, but transformed into a relentless contest of power, where the only thing that mattered was who would emerge stronger from the ruins. After years of relentless destruction, something undeniable began to set in across Europe. Exhaustion, not just among soldiers, but among entire nations that had been drained of strength, resources, and hope. The war had gone on for so long that victory itself started to feel meaningless, because no matter who gained ground, everything around them was collapsing. The once powerful regions of the Holy Roman Empire were now fragmented and broken, their economies shattered, their towns reduced to ruins, their people barely surviving from one day to the next. Trade routes had fallen silent, agriculture had been destroyed, and even the strongest kingdoms were struggling to sustain their own armies. And yet, no one could truly claim to be winning. Every advance came at a devastating cost. Every victory was followed by deeper loss, and every ambition was slowly being buried under the weight of endless war. Leaders who once spoke with confidence now faced reality, realizing that continuation meant only more collapse, more suffering, more irreversible damage across Europe. A shared understanding began to form. unspoken but powerful, this cannot continue because there was nothing left to gain that could justify what had already been lost. And so, from the ruins of exhaustion and desperation, the possibility of ending the war finally began to emerge. And then, after 3 decades of bloodshed, exhaustion finally turned into action. Negotiations began, not from strength, but from desperation. As leaders gathered to bring an end to a conflict that had consumed an entire generation, out of these discussions came a series of agreements that would later be known as the Peace of Westphalia, a turning point that didn't just stop the fighting but completely reshaped how Europe understood power itself. For the first time, the idea of sovereignty became central, meaning that each state would now have authority over its own territory, its own religion, and its own internal affairs. Without interference from outside rulers or empires, this single principle shattered the old structure of the Holy Roman Empire, reducing its influence and confirming the rise of independent states that would now define Europe's future. Borders were recognized more clearly, power became more balanced, and the chaotic system of overlapping authority began to collapse into something more organized, more modern. Nations like France emerged stronger and more influential, while others, including Spain, found their dominance weakened after years of draining conflict. But beyond all the territorial changes, the true impact was deeper, because this was not just about ending a war. It was about rewriting the rules of international relations entirely. The old world, built on religious dominance and imperial control, was giving way to a new system based on political independence and balance of power. And in that moment, history crossed a threshold. Because this wasn't just the end of a war, it was the birth of a new world. When the smoke finally cleared, Europe was no longer the same place it had been before the war. The map had not just changed, it had been reshaped by years of destruction and negotiation. Leaving behind a continent that felt completely transformed, France emerged stronger than ever, stepping into a position of influence that would define its future as one of Europe's dominant powers. While Spain began a slow but steady decline, weakened by the enormous cost of endless conflict, at the same time, the Holy Roman Empire never truly recovered. Its authority permanently reduced, its territories more independent, its old dominance broken beyond repair. What once looked like a unified system of power was now a loose collection of states, each moving in its own direction. The balance of Europe had shifted, and there was no returning to the world that existed before the war. The modern world didn't just evolve, it was forged in fire, shaped by years of chaos, destruction, and rebirth after the 30 Years' War, and the rules created after this war still shape global politics today, influencing how nations interact, balance power, and avoid total collapse. If you found this story powerful, make sure you like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because history is full of moments that changed everything, and this is just the beginning.